Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice. And welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, and I wanted to focus on a short story that is about mental illness and family troubles. I am referring to Down to the Roots from Michael Guista's short story collection, Brainworks. What's interesting about this collection of short stories, as you can see from the cover, is it's very psychological in nature, focusing on people who have mental illness, mental health troubles, or people who are in the mental health field. So for those who don't know, Michael Guista is a writer, or was a writer. I've only found two things that he's written. One is from 2002, which there isn't a lot of information on that particular work, and this from 2005. These are the only two things that he's ever published as far as I know, and based on what I found online, it seems like he's a professor at a college in California. It does say that he got his MFA and then he got a master's in psychology. So I do wonder if he was interested in psychology all along and wanted to write from a sort of psychological perspective, or if he got his MFA and found that there was no work in the field that he could get because he was a bad writer, or because it was just really hard to get published, and he became a psychologist. I don't particularly know. There isn't a lot of information about him out there, but he did win the Catherine Bakeless Nason Prize for Fiction in 2004. So he couldn't have been, that bad in his writing. Although some of this is a bit pretentious at times, I will say. So that's very interesting. I would be interested in discovering more about him because, to go from, writing to psychology, that's not, a small leap. That seems like quite different, but I'm glad he was able to bring that psychology background to his work, because that's different. And as someone who has a degree in psychology, that's something that I'm definitely interested in. So without further ado, let's get straight to this story. I will do a summary of Down to the Roots, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Down to the Roots focuses on a family of four that works on a farm in some undisclosed location. The mother of the family begins sleeping in John and Pat's room. They are the children of the family, and it's indicated that the mother and the father are drifting apart for some unspecified reason. Although the good thing about the story is that Guista, pulls back the layers of this story as he goes along. Something that he does throughout the story, and I will say that's in every aspect of this collection, and that's something that's really good. But we eventually discover that the father is an alcoholic, although he does not recognize that he has a problem. There is a previous divorce that happened in his family, so perhaps it's been going on for years. But only John remembers this. Pat was too young at the time. But he notes that that the mother and the father have been struggling for quite some time. The father is, of course, a farmer, and he drinks, although he says that he only drinks beer and he doesn't drink whiskey, so he can't be that bad. But John is very uncomfortable throughout this story, perhaps because he also recognizes, because he also remembers what happened in the previous divorce. And it seems like he's turning to religion to cope with all of this, but it's actually making things worse for him, because he begins creating whips and just whipping things, and he also prays a lot. But when his prayers aren't answered, he begins to grow more frustrated and angry. And Pat is trying to understand why he's feeling this way, but it seems that he's too young. And even John notes that Pat is too young to really understand, because he doesn't remember the previous divorce that happened. And also, he's not learning the same things that John is learning, because they're both in Catholic school. But Pat is at a certain level, and John is at a higher level. He seems to be unhappy that he doesn't have a confederate or someone to go through this with him, because John is learning about hell and all that, and Pat is not. So as the story goes on, the divorce becomes ever more clear that it's going to happen. And the father even says, like, Pat is on my side because he doesn't view what I'm doing as actually wrong. And Pat and John don't want to be drawn into this, because it'll just make things even harder down the road. And John even notes, like, Pat's too young to understand. So of course he still loves you, but one day he'll be on our side. And the father is very unhappy that John is taking his mother's side in this whole affair. John and the father are both working in the field one day when they begin to have an argument about how the father's habits are hurting the entire family. And the father's like, I can't be that bad if Pat likes me. So I don't think I'm going to change. But he encourages John to, vent his anger, because John believes that because he's angry, he's living in sin. And his father's like, these are just learnings from the church. It's just something you learn. They're just words. It doesn't mean anything. You can feel how you want to feel, which is actually one of the more smarter things that the father has been saying in this entire story. But eventually, a fight breaks out between the father and the son, or the father and John, with the father throwing concrete blocks at John. Eventually, John picks up a board and whacks his father in the head, which seems to cause significant brain damage, or puts the father in a coma. It's not exactly clear, but it does send the father to the hospital, and he's unable to leave for quite some time. And at some point, he either dies or they just stop visiting him as much. But John makes sure to tell Pat, like, just remember that our father was a good man, and they take over the farm. Eventually, they're able to, succeed in making money and taking over for their father. And as the story ends, they kind of look over the valley where the other farmers are growing things and note how this seems to be all there is. There isn't really, anything beyond the farm, at least from their perspective. And so that's where it ends. In terms of analysis, there is a little bit to talk about with this story. One thing that shows up here, as well as in the other stories in this collection, is the theme of mental illness. It is clear that, at least according to what I've read in the DSM-5, the father has substance use problems, and for him, the problem is alcohol. He seems to drink quite a bit of it, enough to the point where it's upsetting the entire family, and it's making his behavior erratic. But it's very interesting that he recognizes that he has a problem, as do most people with mental illness. They recognize that they have a problem, but they are unable to really do anything because it's affecting their behavior. Think about someone with depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Like, they might recognize that they have a problem, but because it's affecting their brain, it's very often difficult to change that behavior. But it's also clear the father is unwilling to change, because as he notes, like, he's just drinking beer. It's not whiskey, so it's not really a problem. And another issue is that he believes that Pat loves him, and so if Pat loves him, what he's doing must not actually be very bad, which is a dangerous line of thinking. People can love you despite the fact that you clearly have a problem, and just because someone loves you, that doesn't mean your behavior is condoned in any sort of way. But it's also clear in the story that John is affected in a way that is leading to him. He might develop a mental illness, or he has already developed one prior to the start of the story because of his experience during the first divorce. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on with John that you can see throughout the story that is not conducive towards the healthy development of a child. Allow me to read you a quote from this. Pat felt sorry for John. Something was still wrong. He was spending more and more time whipping things or lying under the weeping willow, staring up at the sky. Just before he ripped off willows to make whips, he'd push out his lips and push up his nose, mad, looking like their dad got. Then he'd whip the clothesline pole until he looked sad and worn out. For a while, John even started whipping himself on his legs. After he got through whipping the air and the clothesline and his legs, he'd pray. Pat could see his lips moving and his eyes were closed and his head was very still and his face was serious. And it's clear the extent to which John is suffering from mental health troubles. He's whipping himself. He's creating whips in general, which are a very violent tool and indicative that he's feeling a lot of rage within him. He's turning it on himself, and he's at one point it says in the story like he just stares straight through Pat as if he's not even there, indicative that he's finding it harder to relate to other people. And again, like one of John's big problems is that Pat can't relate to him. He doesn't have anyone who can understand how bad their father is because Pat is too young, and what he's learning in Sunday school isn't on par with what John is learning. And he's being told like, oh, like hell is real and God will punish those who deserve it. And it really seems like his father deserves it, but yet nothing happens. So it's causing all sort of stress and grief for John in this story. One thing I like is how Guista gets at how religion sometimes exacerbates these problems. He notes it throughout other stories too. How the religion is making things worse for John because he believes that God is good and that if someone's doing something bad, they will be punished. But again, as I noted before, his father is not being punished in any sort of way. It seems like God might be condoning his behavior if nothing is being done about it. And John is turning to praying and punishing himself for his sins as dictated by Catholicism at times. But that's making things worse for him because if you're praying and no one is answering your prayers, you're going to feel deeply upset. And if you're whipping yourself and expressing all kinds of self-hatred because you felt wrathful, that's just going to make your mental illness worse. You're going to just sink down even further. And so I like how Michael Guista gets at that because sometimes the things that we turn to in life to cope with the stressors that we're dealing with, they don't necessarily make our lives any better. Another thing worth noting is how the family is trying to make things work in this story, possibly related to their Catholicism, how they're unwilling to get divorced. Because the father was already divorced once and now they can't take communion because of that. But so maybe they're trying to prevent further things from being wrong in their religious life. But they turn to forgiveness as well as distance, with the mother sleeping in another room to avoid the father. But that doesn't really seem to be working, as evidenced by another quote in this story. But I don't want to be, and neither does Mom. Well, you're stuck then. And what about Pat? John's voice shook as though it were leaves rustling across pavement. He's different from you, Pat's father said, then spoke more quickly. It doesn't bother him. He doesn't care. Not about any of this, none. But he's getting older. He's in catechism. He'll be learning things. Yeah, well, so what? Just words. That's all learning is. Nothing else, boy. We try to forgive you, John said, standing all the way up. Then you do something else. And from there, you really get like the anger and the sadness here because they're forgiving him. They're trying to explain to him that he's causing all these problems so they can be one big happy family again. And he's not really getting it. The father is not willing to accept his problems, and that's a large part of the thing. Like, a family can try to make things work out, but if one member of the family refuses to grow or change, like, you can't really talk them out of that, and that's the unfortunate truth of life. Another thing we're talking about in that regards is the rewriting history that takes place at the end of the story. Because after the father is put in the hospital, John says to Pat, like, our father was a good man. Remember that. And Pat agrees to that. And it really seems like they're trying to rewrite the family history there, now that the father, is no longer abusive or anything like that. And that seems like a really dangerous thing to do, especially for John and Pat in the future. Because if you try to pretend like the father was great and you don't deal with the trauma that unfolded in that relationship, in the future, psychologists have noted this especially, you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes your father did. And so owning up to it and saying, this man was not good, we can learn how to be different from him. And not simply, placing a marker that he was good because he's not drinking anymore. That's rewriting history, and that's going to doom you to have unsuccessful relationships, including with your children down the road. And not always, but that's just something to be aware about. And this all makes me think of the story's deeper meaning, the title of the story, Down to the Roots, where it really seems like down to the roots of the family, because of this mental illness, it wasn't as successful or as healthy as it could be. The father notes in the story when he's talking to Pat, if the water rushes too fast, it won't get down to the roots and the trees won't grow. And if it goes too slow, it won't get past the leaves, and as a result, the trees won't get enough water and thrive. And so, with down to the roots, what I think what Guista is getting at is that too intense of trauma in a family, that's going to sort of poison the family's well-being, and they won't be able to cope well together, and stuff like this ends up happening. So I do like the title and how it gets you to think more deeply about what all this could mean. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Down to the Roots by Michael Guista from his interesting collection, Brainwork. I do recommend this story. However, there are a lot of other stories in this collection that I feel are pretentious, or they lean too heavily on mental health or mental illness stereotypes, especially a story about someone who has either bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. It's not 100% clear on what that is, but I do feel like he leans so heavily on stereotypes, and it can produce stigma towards mental health or lead to inaccurate beliefs about what mental illness is. And that's something that I'm a stickler for. If you're going to talk about mental health, you better damn not lean on stereotypes, or else I'm going to call you out on that. Which is so weird because, given that he has a master's degree in psychology, you think he wouldn't lean so heavily on stereotypes, but unfortunately that is what happened. And so I do recommend this particular story, but maybe others you could probably skip in this collection. So if you have something to say about this story, feel free to comment below. I would love to hear from you. Let's have a discussion about psychology and Michael Guista. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this type of work. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and psychological travels. Farewell.